So our first panelist is Chris Harley, and he's no stranger to those of you who are here at Hopkins because, of course, he's on sabbatical from UBC, where he's a professor of zoology. And Chris is really perfect to talk about this whole question of what is ocean acidification doing in our coastal environment, because he concentrates on change in the rocky shore ecosystems. And I've had the pleasure of being able to participate in some talks with Chris recently on ocean acidification, and he really knocks my socks off because he has the ability to distill really complex information into such a digestible form, and I should dare say that his website is a really great example of science communication that is super effective. So I would commend his website to all of you just to see how kind of, well, you're really gifted at this, Chris, so yay, we're so happy to have you here. And then we have two other distant travelers, because Chris, of course, coming all the way from Canada. And then we have Brad Warren. Brad, where were you? Oh, there you are, right here. Who has come down from Washington State. Brad is a journalist and also someone who's worked in the fishing industry and has worked on marine conservation for the last 25 years. He is now directing what is called Sustainable Fisheries Partnership program on ocean acidification. And Brad, too, has been a really dynamic spokesperson for the problem of ocean acidification throughout the nation, and you've probably traveled internationally to do this as well, yes. Again, another gifted communicator about this problem and someone who knows the shellfish industry super, super well, which might be the focus of his remarks today, although we have spoken earlier about the broader issue of how ocean acidification is reverberating through the marine food web. So thank you, Brad, for taking the time to come down. And
thanks for making it possible.
All righty. And then our third panelist is someone that when we initially contacted him said, I'm not really sure I'm your guy. And that is Michael Thomas, who has been working on water quality in California, and specifically with the Central Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board for the last, what, 24, 25 years? Yes, in 25. Okay, so we, gosh, between you, I don't know, we're working up on 75 years of experience here, adding a few years, I think, to you, Chris, right? But, so Michael has done virtually everything in the Regional Water Quality Control Board. He's worked with virtually every sector that I can imagine working with, everything from being focused on the 3 power plants in the Central Coast to working on ag issues to working on heavy metals, just to name a few. And for the last 4, 5, 6 years, he's been focused on institutional change. How do you get an institution like a Regional Water Quality Control Board to work completely differently and to challenge itself to conquer water quality problems, which it has, in his mind, hasn't managed to do as effectively as it should have been doing. How does it reorganize itself to attack these water quality challenges in a very different way? So it's going to be really fun because we've been talking with Michael all day today about all the work that we're doing at the Center for Ocean Solutions and spending a lot of time talking about institutional change and ocean acidification. And I think you're going to be a little surprised by his perspective. I know I'm going to plan to learn a lot because he's going to probably challenge us to understand some of the really major barriers out there for our regulatory agencies in thinking through this problem. So with that, Chris, the stage is yours. Thank you.
Well, geez, I feel like I have a lot to live up to now. Thanks for the introduction and for the welcome. Somebody let me know if I'm supposed to be wearing a microphone, because I'm just going to charge ahead, assuming that I'm not supposed to be. So I'm an ecologist, as Meg sort of alluded to. And so I just want to warn you that my perspective on this is ecological, and I think that's why I'm going first, is because maybe I'm the farthest away from actually getting to management. Oh, where's my gun here? Yeah, and in fact, this slide was stolen from a recent presentation of mine where that word actually was ecological. I will go ahead and assume that all of you are at least somewhat familiar with ocean acidification and why it's important. So I'm not going to get into the chemistry or any of that. But I do want to say that ocean acidification is going to have unprecedented and far-reaching impacts on our ecosystems, and we need to be worried about that. But it's not just game over. There are things that we can start doing now which will hopefully minimize some of the negative outcomes of ocean acidification. So for this talk, I want to briefly get into 3 case studies. So I'll talk a little bit about evolutionary adaptation, why that's important, how we can actually manage for that. I'll talk about a case study with northern abalone, which is also called pinto abalone down here, I think. It is endangered in Canada, so that's a conservation story. And then the last one is the red sea urchin, which is an important harvested invertebrate in both California and British Columbia, so that's sort of an economic story. So starting with the evolutionary adaptation one, evolution is our friend. Things may not be that great at dealing with low pH right now, but maybe they will get better at it through natural selection. And we know that natural selection can be important in a variety of situations. We're hoping that's going to come to the rescue of some wild populations. We also know that aquaculturists use selection all the time to get the fastest growing strain and most disease-resistant strain. Maybe they can also find the most low pH resistant strain and take advantage of some of that natural variation within a population. Both of those things require that there be variation, and specifically heritable variation, so it has to be passed on from the parents to the offspring. So the question is, how much heritable variation is out there, and will different species be able to adapt as pH continues to decline? So with some colleagues at Simon Fraser University, and this was led by Jen Sunday, who is a PhD student, we asked, all right, if we look at bay mussels as Middleostrosculus and red sea urchins, Strongylus centrotus franciscanus, and we want to know, all right, will either of these be able to evolve in response to low pH conditions? And so we have to consider things like generation time, whether or not there's variation in heritable traits, and use those things to predict an evolutionary response. At the beginning of this project, my money was on the mussels, because they can reach sexual maturity in about a year. These guys take many years to reach sexual maturity, and they can live for over 100 years. So just the turnover of the population seems like it would favor the mussels. And in fact, the generation time of the mussels is quite short, but the heritable variation was extremely limited. So there just wasn't that much raw material for selection to act on, and as a result, the predicted evolutionary response is very, very slow, or zero for this species. For the urchins, yes, they have a long generation time, but they also have more potentially heritable variation for selection to act on. And as a result, depending on your model, they may actually be able to keep up with the pace of ocean acidification. Now, I need to clarify that this was measured for a single trait, and that was very early larval development. So this doesn't say anything about, will they still be able to grow spines, or will they still be able to eat, or will they still be able to, reproduce. So the single trait we picked suggests that at least one of these species has some heritable variation. Okay, so how can we work with that from the standpoint of management? Well, the first thing we can think about doing is trying to conserve genetic variation, for example, with marine protected areas, because maybe there's just some weird subpopulation someplace in California that has the good genes. And if we let that population go by neglect or accident, then we've lost that genetic potential. If we start, as California has done, establishing marine protected areas up and down the coast, we are sort of banking some of this genetic variation, and maybe those key genes will then start to spread out into the rest of the population as selection demands that they become more common. The next thing we can do is just some quick surveys of what species have a lot of genetic variation and which don't, and we can then define, all right, we think that this species is going to be a highly at-risk species just because it doesn't have much genetic variation, whereas something else with lots of genetic variability, maybe that one is a lower risk species. So that is far from perfect, but it is at least quick. Then finally, where we have genetic variation in species that we eat or fish for, aquaculture can benefit from selective breeding. So if you can find that one strain of oysters that does much better at low pH, then good. The fact that we had the genetic variety in oysters to have that strain is helpful for us. Okay, now abalone, conservation. There's a happy northern abalone. It is, as a population, not very happy at all. There have been really severe declines initially associated with fishing, but the fishery in BC and in California has been closed for decades. The populations are continuing to decline. That seems to be a combination of recruitment failure, so there's just not enough larvae coming in out of the plankton, and previously overharvest from commercial fisheries, now overharvest in the form of poaching. So those are the two things that are happening. And I want to point out that this is sort of a larval thing and that this is a sort of an adult thing. And with my former graduate student Ryan Krim, we actually looked at the effects of elevated CO2 and decreased pH on both the larvae and the adults of this species. Here are just some pictures that Ryan took from his experiments with pH of what we get about now. The shell is nice and spirally, and the animal actually fits inside of it. If you increase the pH to about what we're expecting by the end of this century, the larvae can still make their shells, but they can't make them quite as big as they used to. And the dangly bits can no longer all fit inside. And then if you really ramp up the pH to the, we totally screw the pooch and don't curb our emissions at all, the larvae can barely make a shell. Most of them don't even bother to make a shell. And there are associated changes in mortality. So right now, about 65% of the larvae make it through, and if we increase the pH, it's a little bit under 40% make it through. So big impacts on the larval stage. Turns out there were at least no statistically detectable impacts on the adults. Those damn things grow so slowly. This was a 4-month experiment, so we're talking about really small amounts of growth. But you can see there's a little bit of a trend for increasing the pH, decreases the growth rate, but not significant. And these are now mortality, that didn't change at all. So the adults seem like, well, they may actually be fairly robust in the face of acidification. Okay, so how do we use those little pieces of the puzzle? Well, acidification is going to accelerate the ongoing population declines because we already know that larvae are limiting. And if you start killing more of the larvae before they even make it to the rock, that's bad for the population. Since it may be difficult to control acidification at the scale over which abalone larvae have to travel, fixing other problems is probably going to be really important. So rather than focusing on trying to curb emissions, which will work in 100 years, let's cut down on poaching, because if we can protect the adults, that'll be really helpful. If people have the time and money to do restoration efforts, that's when you can try to surmount this bottleneck at the larval stage, because the larval stage is only 9 days. You can bring those into the lab, you can control the pH very carefully, have high success of larval development, and then once they are little baby juveniles, kick them all out into the Barkley Sound or the coast of California or wherever you want to throw them out, and use that as a restoration technique. And then finally, a lot of this work was done in conjunction with the hatchery, which unfortunately has since gone out of business. But if they had not gone out of business, they would have been excited by this result, because managing the larvae is easy because you only have to do it for 9 days. Managing the adults is a pain because the grow out in their facility is 4 years to reach market size. If the adults have been vulnerable, stop trying to culture abalone, because acidification is going to defeat you. It would just be too expensive to manage things for that long. All right, now the economic example, the red sea urchin fishery. This is a multi-million-dollar fishery in several states and provinces. There are some good fisheries regulations involving things like size limits. There is a minimum size and a maximum size you can catch. Minimum because you don't want to take out all the juveniles. Maximum because you don't want to take out all the big mamas either. And I need to mention they're ecologically important, and I'll return to that right at the end. And another graduate student of mine named Sarah Niehaus worked on sea urchin growth, and we have data that shows that fertilization is impaired. We have some data that shows that larval development is impaired. We're working on putting together the entire life cycle. But her work was specifically on juvenile growth. So the blue line is growth in current conditions, and they do pretty well. The red line is growth in future CO2 conditions, and they don't grow as quickly. Now, the thing that she did that I thought was pretty smart was she took the growth data and used it to reparameterize a population demographic model. And so you can start making predictions about things that people might actually be more interested in, like, all right, how long until they reach sexual maturity? If you need the population to go clipping along, it's going to take an extra year to do that at higher CO2. It's going to take an extra 3 years to reach legal harvestable size in the fishery. And because you have mortality all the way along, that extra 3 years means that fewer animals will reach fishery size. And once they're there, they don't grow up to the really meaty size classes as quickly. So the total harvestable biomass goes down. And this is Sarah's conservative estimate. The more aggressive estimate is more like a 50% reduction in harvestable biomass. So from the fisheries standpoint, that means that the economics of the whole enterprise are going to need to be reconsidered. It doesn't mean that the fishery is going to close, it just means that you have to decide whether it's still worth going out for a decreasing population size of your resource. And then you're going to probably have to do things like rejigger the total catch and maybe some size limits because growth rates are changed. So there's fisheries management implications in here too. Okay, so we know that ocean acidification is a serious problem, but I don't want people to think that we are powerless to deal with it, because then we'll just throw up our hands and things will really go to hell. Some species may have the capacity to adapt, others may not. That's good to know. If we can understand how species are going to respond, that's really good to know, because that can help guide conservation and management. And then there's certain things we can do, like reducing additional stressors, establishing marine protected areas that are going to be really helpful. So we're good, right? No, because all of these things are embedded in an actual food web, and I just described what was going on for that one and that one, but they are eating this, and they're competing with that, and they're getting eaten by those. And so in my lab, we've done lots of work on several components of this benthic food web. And just to boil down a 45-minute talk into 3 colored bars, the seaweeds and the phytoplankton tend to either not care or do a little better with acidification. All of these shelled grazers and herbivores tend to do worse. And the sea stars, like acidification, they actually grow a little faster, they eat a little bit more. So it's going to start shifting a lot of things in this food web. How is it going to play out? Well, remember, each of these species has actually got multiple life stages. So it's a fertilization, larval development, settlement, metamorphosis, adult, growth. And then there's all these connections between the species. And this is already a hugely simplified food web. Now I'm going to take out all of the arrows where we literally know nothing. And we literally know almost nothing. So we can make some basic predictions, like sea stars are going to eat more mussels, probably going to be fewer mussels, maybe fewer urchins, which could be good for kelp. But beyond some simplistic predictions, detailed predictions are really challenging right now. So summary part 2, I just want to emphasize that, okay, what I already summarized was it's a serious problem. We need to start dealing with it now. But we still have a lot that we need to learn. So how will communities change? How will entire ecosystems change? And that, I think, is one of the big research priorities right now. So I will leave it at that. Thank you for your attention.
While Brad's stepping up, I forgot to mention that Michael traveled all the way from San Luis Obispo this morning and drove up here, so thanks for doing that.
Thank
Which
you.
one are you, persons or?
OA for COS, it's called. Yeah, thank you. Well, I will try to canter through these fast. There are a lot of them. The first thing that happens when we encounter ocean acidification is usually that. It's I think that the Japanese horror movie is a really good source of metaphors for understanding the world. Our actual experience suggests that really it's not as terrifying as one thinks at first, because in the end it's just another resource management problem. We've met lots of those. We've handled some of them well, not all of them. The basic first resource management lesson most of us learn in life comes from Mom. She comes into our room and she says, "Clean that damn thing up." And then we say, "Mom, I can't, it'll break the economy," which is basically what the coal industry has been saying. Really, when you look at this, you realize every time you have to institute management of anything, and in fish, which is the world I know best, the excuses are awfully familiar. We can't possibly do that. The ocean's full of fish. First of all, we couldn't possibly hurt them. The climate is invulnerable. Nothing we do can affect it. The ocean is too big. We can't possibly change its chemistry. Catch limits? No, we can't do that. It'll bankrupt the fleet. On and on and on. And we're hearing essentially the same excuses from people who don't want to deal with this. Really, the only force that you can meet denial with is an economic stakeholder group, somebody whose ox is getting gored. So who's that? It's a lot of people, some of whom I know and have spent a lot of my life with. There's a lot of money in fish. There's a lot of money in other things that depend on a healthy living ocean. Now, bear in mind, a lot of this is fishery economics and therefore is fishy. Really, you kind of need a turban to conjure some of these numbers. But having said that, NOAA says there's around 1 million jobs in seafood somehow in the United States now. Sales impact, they put it 116 billion. Recreational fishing is valued at anywhere between 8.4 and 20 billion. Coral reefs are valued in a factor of 10 variance there, up to 375. Really, that gives you some idea of the error bars that should be around everything we talk about when we value these large and difficult to measure economic quantities. Some people estimate that an FAO uses this number, that around 3 billion people rely on seafood for something like 15% of their animal protein. And that's maybe right. That's a lot of people. So there are a lot of people who want an ocean that's healthy. When you look at what makes acidification a problem, if we only had to deal with what is actually an extremely rapid rate of change in the average pH of the ocean and the consequences of that, it's very, very fast. It's 10 to 100 times faster than anything seen in millions of years. But it's still not as fast as what's happening in the hotspots. The hotspots are, by sort of a gruesome coincidence, pretty much the best places to fish. Where we get most of our seafood are places that are naturally loaded with nutrients and carbon. That's why they're so productive. Then you take these places and you add more and more and more and more, and they're going to get to their tipping points quicker. So estuaries, bays, upwelling zones, we're in one here, right? This whole west coast of North America. These are places it's happening much faster, and you get some measurements in the water that don't kind of reflect the global advance toward 2x CO2 by 2100. No, we're there now in a lot of places, and we're beyond it. So there are some lessons to be drawn from the experience of the shellfish industry dealing with this here on the West Coast, where they are the front line, and in particular in the hatcheries, where they're taking in seawater and they're seeing their larvae dissolve. This image here is actually from the East Coast, but the same thing is happening in hatcheries. This is at pH 7.5. That's a hard shell clam larvae at about 100 microns of size. When it goes in the water, it looks like dinner. A day later, there's less of it, quite a bit less, and it's visibly framed. 3 days later, it's dead. That's happening by the billions inside the hatcheries that are trying to grow Pacific oyster larvae on the West Coast. Pacific oyster is the dominant cultured oyster all over the world. It's important. It's the species that's been most robust and most productive in that industry. it's not the only one that's having trouble. It's the one that's having the most and the best documented trouble. So this turned into a serious problem for them, coincident with about the time that Dick Feely and others demonstrated that you have this upwelling, accelerated cycle of essentially a hotspot for acidification on the West Coast. And when the industry learned about this, they were terrified. This was the first time you saw a significant sector of the U.S. seafood industry stare down the muzzle on this thing and say, that's not just something that we should worry about someday. We are now watching our larvae disappear. We are having a shortage of supply of seed that we grow out in our farms. And there's, $100 million in annual revenue, actual money people earn. It's an industry. They took this seriously and have been the most committed part of the seafood industry globally in addressing this problem so far. How they have rebounded, what it boils down to is monitoring first, and then you find out that there are oscillations in the chemistry in the water, and you can dodge some of the periods when it's particularly bad. You can do that for a while. You can also do some things, you can do it for a while. At some point, this chemistry gets out of bounds, and you can't use the oscillations anymore because they've moved up through the ceiling. Along the way, as Chris explained, people are looking at how to exploit genetic variations. Are there ways to breed for resistance? I don't think the answers there are known. What's really helped them rebound has been to be able to see the fist coming. If you can duck, you can stay in the fight. It's the first thing you learn when you're a school kid and the bully comes after you. Watch for that fist. It's the same thing. The second thing that has made a huge difference for them is they have hatcheries. And you think this one through for a minute. Without hatcheries, there would be essentially no future for the West Coast bivalve shellfish aquaculture industry. None. They're not going to make it on wild production. And this is going to be true as acidification advances for more and more species. And so the industry is going to do what they have always done when they run into an early life cycle reproductive failure that they can't solve other ways. In other words, habitat goes south and they do the natural thing. They protect the early life cycle with a fortress. It's called a hatchery. There are consequences of that, and they're not all, it's not all a pretty picture. Just because you can do this doesn't mean that in the long term it's all that great a way to go. It just means if you want seafood and you're willing to let your ocean continue to get more acidified, you will have nothing but hatcheries to get your seafood from. So the first step in monitoring is you get in the water and you look at some things. It turns out you have to look at them with greater precision than people have usually looked at water quality. pH, PCO2, temperature, salinity, depth. The PCO2 and pH, sometimes DIC, some things like that. A lot of these are variables that are not typically measured when people are looking at water quality. So the world of people who measure water quality, who think they understand it, is typically unable to contribute to the discourse about how to deal with acidification until they learn some things about how to get data that means something in this context. They don't even use tools that can produce accurate enough readings. It's a painful lesson because the stuff you have to use is expensive, as I'm sure Bruce knows more than most of us. This is a readout of PCO2 at Taylor's hatchery. Taylor is the largest U.S. shellfish grower. They have about 8,000 acres in cultivation. They're international in scope, but they're headquartered in Washington State. And this is at their hatchery at Dabob Bay in Washington State. And this change that you see here, which really, here is the reading in PCO2, parts per million of CO2 in the seawater. This elbow occurs where they move from the water going into this device that measures this is changed from here. They're taking water near the surface, and then they move to a second input that's at 100 feet of depth. And instantaneously, when you go down to 100 feet, you're into water that's a whole lot more acidified. There's a lot more CO2. It's cooler. It's lower in the water column. This would be true in most places, but it's particularly so in their bay. The concentration of CO2 essentially triples when you change from near the surface to 100 feet deep. You get up to around 1,000 parts per million. At that concentration, you cannot grow larvae of Pacific oysters, and in fact, quite a number of other species. They're well beyond the fatal range at that point. This is the main adaptive strategy the industry is using. When the pH is high, which is to say that CO2 concentration is low, at that point, they spawn. These animals have a better chance at that point. That tends to be get your water in the afternoon when photosynthesis has been doing its job, all in the sunlight, and all kinds of seagrasses and things have been growing, and the water is kind of good. You wait till morning and fill your tanks, and you're just going to dissolve larvae, especially during the upwelling time. So you don't spawn during these valleys. You can buffer. You can filtrate, you can aerate to off-gas the CO2. Some people are experimenting with making artificial seawater. So far as I know, none of these are proving to be really effective. You'd think that buffering would do it. It's just an acid-base problem, right? Well, we wish. The world would be sweet if it were simple and held still when we told it to. It doesn't. There's more than the pH that changes. You have a whole suite of variables which frankly are not fully understood. And the engine of mortality associated with that is not entirely pinned down. It's going to take more than just buffering to get happy larvae out of this problem. You can improve their survival, but you don't just get a clean win. Now, if you look at the steps they've taken, first, monitor, second, try to find ways to work around the problem, and the third and the long-term thing, which is the thing that almost everyone who's serious about this realizes you have to do, is also the one that has it's political, it's uncertain. You've got to get policies that get a grip on emissions. You've got to get policies that improve our understanding of what's changing so we can manage the best we can. If we don't know what's going on, we're not going to be able to manage. This is a dismal time to try to get money out of government. All of this work is hard, and it involves political uncertainties. And the companies that are trying to make their living at this, and the families that own these farms and fishing vessels, people who fish for a living, they look at this and they go, politics? I didn't go into fishing because I like politics. I like to be on the water. I want to be out there with my gumboots on. Don't tell me I have to go deal with politicians. I hate them. And it's the last thing they want to do. Some of them turn out to be pretty good at it, which is fortunate. And they have already managed to do some things that are kind of useful. One measure of what they have done, RGGI, I'll give you a couple, I won't go through the whole list here. RGGI is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Northeast. It's from Maryland to Maine, it's 10 states. It's been up and running since 2008, started being developed in about 2005. It establishes a greenhouse gas trading market for coal-powered utilities, basically. And it has, like almost every carbon policy in the world, it has rather unambitious goals. I think it was to reduce emissions by 10 or 15% by 2020. Well, it turns out that since it went into effect, emissions in the RGGI region are down by like 33%. Not just because of RGGI, but it seems to have been one of the sort of tipping points in a system that was headed toward change, and this sped it up. And it's kind of interesting. It's under review now, and the policy discussion is all over the map. You have the coal industry funding attempts to repeal it, which they haven't really been able to succeed at, interestingly enough. They have way more money than anyone on this side of the equation does. But for whatever reason, they're not winning. Then you have the general consensus among folks on the environmental side, which is we should tighten RGGI since we've already exceeded its goals and try to make it an engine for improving the reductions from here. Fishermen and some growers and seafood processing companies stood up and joined that voice. And what their argument was, which we encouraged them to do, was regulating emissions of CO2 is just about the only insurance policy we can buy to reduce the risk to our production from unchecked emissions. As a society globally, we churn out 30-some billion tons of CO2 a year, and that number is rising. It rose 5% in 2010. It's remarkable. This is, in all but now there are 32 or so countries that regulate this. In the rest of the world's 100 and some more countries, there's no regulation for this. And it's poorly regulated, I would argue, even in the places that do it. This is the fundamental challenge for most of this problem. In the nearshore zone, we have a similar problem. An almost equally large waste stream of nutrients comes off of the land and into the bays and drives processes like eutrophication, which not only depress the oxygen, but almost the same reaction cycle. It's like the other side of the coin, is that you increase CO2. When all that algae rots, what does it produce? More CO2. It's a very simple conceptual map. And you wind up with two great drivers that constitute the great unmanaged waste streams of our society. The room that our mother has not persuaded us to clean up. She's speaking kind of loud if you listen. And this is the Japanese representation. Mothra is our friend in the war with Godzilla. It's Mothra who kicks Godzilla's butt for messing with people. And here she's dragging him backwards off the island. Now, can we really cut carbon emissions, or is this just a cartoon? I would say yes, we can, and the evidence is in front of us all over the place. This is just a couple of things I picked up in the last week. LG Electronics, which makes flat screen TVs and cell phones and yada yada, has just announced that they're going to reduce their carbon footprint by 50% by 2020. Now, no one who runs a company like that does that. Nobody makes that kind of promise unless they know they can do it today using today's technology and in a way that's either cost-effective or profitable. It just doesn't happen. Corning, which is not out here, but Corning, big glass company, one of their executives was at a conference, I was listening. Said, you know, we melt rocks for a living. We go through a lot of energy. There's a ton of heat going out of those smokestacks. If we figure out how to use that instead of just blowing it into the sky, don't you think we could waste less? Maybe we'd spend less on energy? So the board puts up a fund for the managers and say, look, here's $5 million. Give us some kind of return on our investment and do something to save energy. Have at it. Come back in a year, tell us how you did. The managers put in their projects, they get the money, they go do it, they come back in a year. Well, the board says, did you get us the return on investment? They wanted 25% return on investment. Pretty nice return. I would have thought kind of ambitious. The managers say, well, we got you 100 to 200%. Board says, how about we double the money? 10 million next year. No problem. A year later, the managers come back 100 to 200%. Board says, we're doubling it every year until ROI drops to 25%. And then we'll just think about it. Maybe we'll do something. You know, I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't think that I've ever made an investment that consistently returns 25%. If that's the minimum for investing in energy efficiency, we have a lot of road to run. This is an enormous resource. This is, and it's available now. It's not only cost effective, it's profitable. This is not some kind of fantasy of a green future. This is just companies doing stuff that pays, which they can do now. This is the Bering Sea crab fleet. This is posted on their website, Bering Sea Crab Association website. When they rationalized their fishery in 2005, they reduced the number of vessels by about 2/3, and that's what happened to their carbon footprint. Went through exactly the same reduction. So they're making the same money, fewer boats are making it, they're happier, they're more prosperous. The ones who left got paid to go away. The reason it happened all at once is they were waiting to get paid. There was a bunch of them who knew that somebody was going to pay them to go away. This was their retirement plan. So they took the check and they went away. And the ones who stayed in the game are producing the total allowable catch of crab, no problem. And they're making better money doing it. And they're producing about a third as much carbon. One move. That wasn't a complicated, elaborate carbon reduction scheme. It's an inadvertent consequence of doing what turns out to be good for their businesses. And it just happens that that one single move reduced their emissions by about as much as our civilization needs to reduce it by 2050 in order to avoid catastrophic climate change and ocean acidification, according to UNFCCC numbers. Now, the rest of us are all whining and wondering how we're going to pull this off and saying we can't possibly clean our room or it'll break the economy. And here are these guys, they've just done it. And they made money doing it. This is not one of those bark at the moon propositions. This is utterly doable. So here's what some of the people I know in the industry are saying about this. Bill Dewey is at Taylor. He's been very active and had a lot to say. He published in the Seattle Times last week probably the strongest statement by any major seafood company in the US about ocean acidification, saying we've really got to get on top of this. It's a threat to our future and to the ocean. Clem Tillion is a former 9-term Republican legislator. He was president of the Senate in Alaska. He was a commercial fisherman for all his life. And in 2009, he started writing op-eds and speaking publicly and saying, we got to deal with this carbon problem. Now, Clem is an outlier by any measure. Anyone who knows him would tell you that they broke the mint when they made him. So it's not exactly a model for Republican behavior, but it does tell you that you don't have to be a Democrat or a liberal. He's certainly not, to think that this is something worth doing. Clem's concerns are two. He thinks we shouldn't use it all up. Oil is a really good fuel. We should leave some for people who come after us. He's got grandchildren. He wants them to be able to enjoy it too. He also has grandchildren who he wants to be able to eat fish and make a living fishing. The ocean was good to him. He thinks it should still be good for his grandchildren. This guy's great. This is Dean Blanchard. He is, he says, the largest shrimp buyer on the Gulf Coast. I'm not sure I believe it. Dean is, he's in Grand Isle, and his take is, I don't know what's happening, but our shrimp are jumping up in the beach and committing suicide. They're not leaving a note saying why. I want to know why. So he goes to the Congress and gives testimony saying, you figure out why this is happening. If it's acidification, I want to know it. This is a demonstration that we sponsored. 500 people, 100 vessels spelled this out on the water in Homer, in Alaska, in 2009. Interestingly, while I was there during the organizing of this, I went to visit a couple who are elder statesmen of the Alaska fishing industry. They're both really pioneering fishermen, highliners and revered innovators, and very, very conservative. They live on a ranch outside of Homer. And very quietly, they didn't want to go public about this or anything, but they offered to supply buoys and rope to the people doing this. They weren't going to participate, no way. But they wanted this to work. And they had equipment they thought could be useful, so they offered it to the people putting this thing together, and it was used. So I go out to see them, and we have a long chat, and I'm leaving, and Jessie's leaving. She's on her way to the Republican Central Committee meeting in Anchorage. She's on it, and she stops, and she and her husband turn, and they look at their land, and they tell me, we used to have trees all over this land. Then the spruce beetle invasion came because it's so warm in the winters now, and the beetles got in. And all the forests all over the peninsula here burned. So instead of have a fire hazard or a disease vector for our neighbors, we cut down all of our trees. We had to. And then they turn and they look at the bay and they say, you know, there used to be a shrimp fishery here. It's too warm. The shrimp can't make it anymore. The shrimp aren't going to come back till it gets cool, if it ever does. And same with the crab. And they fished those fisheries. They were pioneers in the development of the fishery economy of their region, where people actually learned how to make a decent living in a place where no one had ever had money. And they actually showed their neighbors how to make money in ways no one had ever seen before, because there was this abundant resource that you could turn into a living right there on their doorstep. And it was them who figured out how to harvest it. And it was them who watched it disappear because it couldn't reproduce as the temperature rose. And they're looking at this, and they're beyond denial. It's not a possibility for them. They stay who they are. And who they are is who I want them to stay. I don't want them to become Al Gore. I want them to compete with Al Gore for the high ground. Let them go to the Republican Central Committee and bring the party along with them. This is going to be an issue that right now, it's got a lot of ideological noise about it. There's a lot of discussion about how this is a liberal issue or a democratic issue. It's a universal issue. If you're human, if you eat seafood, if you like the things that swim in the sea, if you like diving, if you want the future where your children get to have these things, you care. And that's something, for me, that's probably the best reason for hope. And the best moves that we can make are the ones that allow people who disagree with us about a lot of things, not to agree with us about this necessarily, but to compete with us in defining answers. If they get there better than we can, more power to them. That's all.
Okay. So when Meg asked me to be on this panel, I said, after reading her email and her invitation, I said no. Because I said, I don't think I'm qualified to be on the panel, and because ocean acidification is a global issue, and local and regional agencies really have no control over it, no influence over it. So it's a global issue. And Meg then sent me a paper that she co-authored, published, and explained that what the actions were that local agencies could take to deal with ocean acidification. And when I read them, I realized those are the same actions that we, through an internal process that we went through in our organization, decided were our highest priorities. So the actions that were described in your paper were lined up with our priorities. So I said, sure, I'll go, and I'll be there. So what are we going to do about ocean acidification? After hearing the last two presentations, it is a real issue. There are real impacts from it. But we're not going to address ocean acidification by itself, per se. And we couldn't. Based on the other two talks that you heard tonight, I could not take that information and go to my board, decision makers, and ask them to make decisions that would impact an industry, for example, because there, as some key things were said during these presentations. One was that we actually, Chris, you said we actually know very little, and we need to learn a lot more about this. So when you go to a group of decision makers and tell them about a problem, and then we say, here's what we really know about that problem, and if it's very little, you've just given them an off-ramp. If it's a very difficult decision to make, and there's a lot of uncertainty around that decision, then we'll take the offer. Especially when you're faced with placing a burden on others, the people who would have to implement the actions to comply with our requirements. And the larger that burden is, the more intense the pressure to take those off ramps. So what we would have to do is look at the overall picture. We'd have to take ocean acidification and put it in the larger picture with the other very serious and large issues that we're facing, like fish population declines and dead zones, plastics in the ocean, plankton declines. Some of the science that's being done around these things is staggering. And what I have learned in the past few years is that what's even more staggering is that decision-making bodies like the board I work for are unaware of the significance of these things. So, on the land side, we have deforestation, deforestation, aquatic habitat destruction, and loss. And aquatic habitat loss, we've decided that's one of our highest priorities in that region. And traditionally, it's not something that we dealt with. The water boards did not deal with aquatic habitat. We protect aquatic habitat from discharges, but we do not protect the aquatic habitat itself from things like being universally removed, from being denuded, say, riparian areas and their buffer zones. So we're now focused on that in our office. We're becoming more focused on it. And it's extremely controversial. We're getting into areas of land use planning and pushing the boundaries of our authority, or the perceived boundaries of our authority. So while we're talking about these other issues, this is going on. And this is something we don't talk about, the ramifications of this. This is talking about these things and doing research on these things and planning to take actions on these things is all well and good. But while we're doing that, this is going on. And at some point, it's going to be too late. I don't know where that point is, but we have to bring that concept into this discussion. We have to add urgency to this discussion with decision makers like my board, so that they understand that there actually are tipping points here, and we have to act before we reach them. In California, there are over 300 boards and commissions. We're the only state in the United States that governs like this. It presents an extraordinary challenge to move forward in a progressive way, to try and make decisions by committee. Not just a committee, but 300 of them. First thing that Arnold Schwarzenegger did when he became governor, after saying, "I want to blow up the boxes," is he put together a blue ribbon panel to study the state of California and determine what's wrong with it. And came out with the California Performance Review, and what they said is, this is what's wrong with it. And we need to eliminate, consolidate these boards and commissions, and do a better job of describing what their role actually is. What is the outcome that they are trying to achieve? And one of my pet peeves with our boards and commissions is that they don't have job descriptions. These are political appointments, people that are on this position. They don't have a job description. So they will come onto the board for the board or a commission for some interest that they have often, and then find out what it is that we actually do on the job. We had one new board member 2 years ago who decided that the water boards should not be regulating local municipalities, and he was going to get on the board and fix that. When he came onto the board, he realized that that was a small part of what we actually do, and that it was state and federal law, and he had no say over it. So we need to do a better job of describing what these jobs are and what we are responsible for, and actually set up job expectations for those people coming onto the commissions. So if you were on one of these boards of commissions and you were presented with the acidification issue, what would you do? The arguments that we would probably have are these. The argument that would be presented to the board. Acidification might have a negative effect on calcifying organisms, but we need more research. The counter argument would be controlling pollution runoff will have a devastating impact on the $37 billion a year ag industry, which feeds millions of people and is the foundation of the California economy. This is an argument that's presented to us every time we have a board meeting. And, I should say and here, not or, the municipalities that we're regulating with our stormwater regulations. Controlling pollution runoff will force municipalities to close libraries and lay off police and firemen. We hear this almost every board meeting that we have. The board hears it, the decision makers hear it over and over and over again. So what they hear are these types of arguments compared to these types of environmental arguments where there might be a problem, but we need more research. And by the way, do you have any funding available? Which argument is going to win? Every time. We are killing ourselves with these kinds of arguments. We have to do a much better job on how we present this information to decision makers. And some numbers that you saw in Brad's presentation, I think you actually changed these. Or Brad, I think you actually changed
Yeah, I
these.
updated some of that stuff, yeah.
So I wanted to compare the numbers. Because when we present information to decision makers along these lines, where, and this happens all the time, happens every time. Seafood worldwide, I think you increased that number, but $100 billion.
That's a rough estimate of wholesale trade globally.
And in the U.S., commercial fisheries, $28 billion. So those are rough numbers. And one of the things that you said is you'd have to wear a turban to come up with these numbers. So right away, if we presented information where we had a lot of uncertainty around the numbers, we provide a convenient off-ramp for decision makers. The ag industry, they know how much they generate. They know it to the nth degree, and they present that information very well. Agriculture worldwide, $3.5 trillion. In the United States, $161 billion per year. In California alone, $37.5 billion last year, and increasing. While most industry revenue is decreasing over the past few years because of the recession, ag industry is increasing. This is the foundation of our economy in California. And it is an extraordinarily powerful industry. They have a more powerful lobby than probably all other industries combined. And even more than that, we have, this is part of our culture on the Central Coast of California. It is literally found, the influence of agriculture is found throughout every layer of government and every layer of our society on the Central Coast. So, to give you an example, when we increase our regulation, our requirements over municipalities, they complain and they point to us here in Salinas or in Santa Maria. When we're meeting with them, they point out the window and they say, look out the window. What are you doing about that problem? And they're pointing to the ag fields that surround their cities. And they say to us, we can show you the data where the toxicity is coming into our city from these ag fields. What are you going to do about that? And we explain to them what we are going to do about that. What is on the books? What we have drafted and what we are presenting to our board. Increased regulation, increased requirements on the ag industry. And we say, we would like you, since you are receiving some of this pollution and having to deal with it, to provide comments to our board. We say, no, we're not going to do that. Can't do it. Because of the influence of agriculture throughout all layers of our government. Cities and counties depend on the agriculture in their areas to survive. They depend on the revenue that's generated from it. It's not just a technical problem or a scientific problem. It's not just an economic problem. It is culture. And it's culture wrapped around the almost mythical status of the family farm. We have industrial agriculture. They come into our office and argue with us about, you realize you're destroying the family farm. We're talking to a person who has 1,000 acres or 3,000 acres or 5,000 acres in production. And they make that argument because it's an effective argument to them. So we need a more comprehensive approach that connects decision makers with the future that we are creating. We have to start talking about decision makers, about what the direction that we are headed with all of these problems that we have. We have to bring this larger picture somehow into this scenario. By the way, if you can guess where this came from, you win a prize. What? What is it? No.
12 Angry Men?
Yes. And the prize is a copy of this presentation. Congratulations. So we have to do a better job of bringing the larger picture and the future that we are creating into this arena, into the decision maker arena. And that's what we're struggling with right now in our agency, trying to figure out. I don't have the answer. We are completely committed to figuring this out and to do it. Because I can't go out and change the structure of California with 300 boards and commissions. We can't change that overnight. That is the governing structure. So we have to work with it. We have to figure out a way to bring this information into this arena in a meaningful way. We have to think about what are the conditions that we are creating with our actions today. Bob Woodward was writing a book about George Bush, so he was following him around for many months, and he asked him the question, what will people say in 50 years that, what will they say? How will they look back on the decisions that you are making now? And he answered immediately, it doesn't matter, we'll be dead. That was one of the most profound things out of that book. It was extraordinary to me. The president. And I don't know if he meant we'll all be dead, or that he and his fellow decision makers will be dead, so it doesn't matter. I don't know. And it doesn't matter. But what it illustrates is how our brain works. Unfortunately, our brains are designed to respond to the immediate. We're not good at thinking about and acting on ocean acidification. We're not good at it. We're good at, when is this thing going to be over? Right? When is he going to stop talking? So that we can go. We're going to go have a beer. So, we're good at the short term, and our brains are designed for it. There's a reason for it. It's survival. We are good at reacting to the immediate. We're not good at thinking about the long term and acting on the long term. We think we've progressed a lot, but that part of our brains has not. It still functions the way it did back when. And we have to understand that. We have to realize that. And we have to bring more relevant, more immediate information to the decision makers. We have to translate it somehow so that it feels more immediate. This is the Salinas Valley. We are located, where are those pointers not open? Well, you know where we're located. Yeah, we're up there. In the Salinas Valley, we have a lot of data on water quality in our region. We have created a regional monitoring program that is unique in the state of California. I think it's unique in the country, actually, for a regulatory agency like ours. We have a tremendous amount of monitoring, so we've got a really good handle on the condition of surface water quality in our region. We have some of the most toxic surface water in the state of California. Congratulations. We have some of the highest use of pesticides in the state of California. More pesticides applied per acre here than anywhere else, because the productivity here is so great. We have production that goes on year round, so it's like a constant farming environment. And we're getting sometimes 4 crops per year out of field, so it's a lot of chemicals are being applied to produce that crop. The Salinas River area had the highest percent of study sites with pyrethroid detections, pesticide detections of that particular pesticide, with 85%. 85% of the samples that came back tested positive for those pesticides. We had the highest percentage of sites exceeding toxic levels. Almost half of them were toxic. 22%, which I don't have any, 22% were highly toxic, meaning that everything we tested died. All of the organisms, 100% of them died for each species that we tested. 22% of the sites. We have a similar situation in Santa Maria in heavily irrigated ag irrigation areas. So we have a serious problem with toxicity in our region, the discharge of pesticides. We also have tens of thousands of tons of fertilizer applied per year. A significant portion percolates downward into the groundwater, and in this area, this is many of the rural residents here, all of the rural residents here are on domestic wells, shallow wells. And we're investigating now, and have been for the past 2 years, just how bad this problem is. We think we have around 10,000 people that are drinking water that is likely to be polluted with nitrates, and they don't know. So we have a program in place to notify them, provide them with information so that they can make decisions about how to deal with it. And we're doing investigations to determine, to try and find cases where we have known sources polluting known wells, so that we can follow up and take action on it. One of the things that the water boards can do is require replacement water. When we have a well that is polluted, we actually have an authority, once we identify who has caused the pollution, require those individuals to provide replacement water to the user. So I was just talking about the Salinas Valley. Salinas Valley here, and this is the Central Valley, which dwarfs the problems that we have here in Salinas Valley. The amount of pollution coming out of the Central Valley, out to San Francisco Bay, actually dwarfs the problems we're dealing with. We have 430,000 acres of irrigated ag in our region. They have 7 million. Their problems are dwarfed by the Midwest, draining to the Gulf of Mexico. I'm sure you've read about the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, 6,000 or 7,000 acres, depending on the year. So why is that? Well, agriculture was the only entity exempt from the Clean Water Act when it was adopted in 1972. The family farm. It should be exempt. So our regulatory approach in the past several decades has been education, outreach, and grants to try and influence what is being done and try to improve agricultural practices. Our office alone has managed over $60 million in grants in the past 10 years for the ag industry. Issued these grants for the benefit of the ag industry. Demonstration projects, best management practices, restoration, things like that. Our parent agency, the State Water Board, has issued over $600 million of these types of grants for the ag industry in the past 10 years. Prior to that, I tried to find the information going back further, but the records weren't good enough for me to actually get that information. So I only went back 10 years. Unfortunately, the problems have only gotten worse. So we know that this is not the solution. To continue to put money into, and especially this kind of money, into education, outreach, and grants. It's not working. The state board recognized that it was not working, and in 2004, they adopted a new non-point source control policy, which said we have to move away from this, and we have to start regulating this entity the way we regulate other entities. And we can do that because agriculture is not exempt from the Port of Cologne Water Quality Control Act, which was adopted in 1969. It just hasn't been applied to agriculture. We are trying to do that now in our region, and it is the most controversial thing that we've ever done. Again, because agriculture is a huge part of our culture on the Central Coast. It's a $6 billion a year industry on the Central Coast, a $27 billion a year industry in the state of California. So this change that we're trying to bring about is extraordinarily difficult. The first hurdle that we had to overcome was in our own office, because we were doing this. We were doing it for many, many, many years. And we established our own internal culture. We established relationships with the ag industry and the support organizations for the ag industry based on that. And when we started to change, there was a revolt in our office that you can't do this. It's not how we do business. It was very difficult for us to overcome that internally, and now we're trying to overcome that externally. So the industry is, and understandably, when you see this is the history, understandably upset at us for changing direction. And so were many other organizations that support agriculture. And many still are. So to try and put it in a little bit more context, I want to talk about the scale of regulation. So this is a low level of regulation. The other end of the scale is a very high level of regulation. So in timber harvesting in our region, we have a very low level of regulation, and it's decreasing. Urban stormwater, about medium compared to other things, and it's increasing. Municipal wastewater has a very high level of regulation. Any drinking water pollution problem, or drinking water pollution case, has a very high level of regulation. Landfills, very high. Irrigated agriculture is the lowest of anything that we regulate. It's the lowest level of regulation. But we're trying right now to increase that. Now, compare this to the relative degree of water quality impacts. Timber harvesting is very low because of the way it's done in our region. It's almost non-existent for the most part, water quality impacts. Landfills are very low. And the reason is because based on regulations, they've completely changed the way they've designed and operate landfills over the past couple of decades because of the regulations. Municipal wastewater, the impacts are relatively low, again, because it's highly regulated. Urban stormwater, the impacts from that are still high because it's the consumption of aquatic habitat, impervious surfaces, and the pollution that runs off of those areas. Drinking water pollution cases, we still have many of those cases, and they present a high risk to the public and remain very high priority. Irrigated agriculture, as far as relative degree of water quality impacts, it's off the chart. If you compare the pollutant loading from that source, from irrigated ag, to all the others, you find that it is greater than all others combined. And yet, this is where it is in terms of regulation. That's what we're trying to change. It's very scary for the industry and the supporting organizations. So our biggest challenges. Well, our biggest challenge was us, internal, to change the way we were doing business. Even though we can do the studies that show the impacts and show the amount of pollutant loading, it's extraordinarily difficult to change the way an organization operates, the way it has been operating for many years. But we took that on. We had to make changes internally that were very difficult to make and caused a lot of strife, but we made those changes. Now we have a team in place that is taking on this problem and has been going gangbusters on it for the past 2 years. So we have been making that change. Industry, obviously, it needs to change. It may be, in the end, it may be forced to change. It may do some of this work voluntarily, implement some of the controls voluntarily, but it may be forced to do so. It remains to be seen. Research institutions, why would they need to change? The reason that I have that up there is that over many years of working with scientists on issues that we face, I have had a big challenge of getting research scientists to state that there is a problem and it needs to be addressed, and to state what the actions are that we should take to address them. Almost always, when we're dealing with research scientists, they say, we think there's a problem here, but we need to do more research. And by the way, do you have any money? And like I said earlier, the problem with that is you've just given the decision makers an off-ramp. You've kicked the can down the road. And we need to think about these things differently. Instead of thinking that we have to determine cause and effect with a certain degree of statistical certainty, otherwise we don't know anything, what we have to do is step back and look at the general direction of all of these issues that we're dealing with. What future is being painted here? What is the trend? What is the direction that's indicated? And say it unequivocally. This is the future we are heading towards. And then make it more relevant and immediate for the decision makers, so that they can act on it. Educational institutions, we have to do a much better job of educating people as they go out into these industries about what is actually going on, and again, the direction that we're going in. We work with Cal Poly University in San Luis Obispo. One of the areas we worked with them was grazing. They've got 6,000 acres in grazing. And we set up a monitoring program because they were using grazing practices that were damaging the water quality in the environment and the aquatic habitat on their property. But when we went to talk to them about it, they said they couldn't see it. So we set up a paired watershed study. We found 2 watersheds that were as close as possible in the physical characteristics that we could find. And on one, we said, keep managing it the way you're managing it. And on this other one, I want you to implement these best management practices. It was a 10-year study. After 3 years, they came to us and they said, we're convinced we're converting all 6,000 acres to these new methods because we're getting more productivity off of these fields. We're ready. And so we want this land that is in your control, which is in the control we were telling them, keep doing it the way you have been doing it. And we said, no. It's a 10-year study. You've got to keep doing it the way that you have been doing it so that the results are statistically valid. And at the end of the study, so before the study was even over, they converted all 6,000 acres to the new way of ranching, and now they teach that. Prior to us doing the study and working with them, they were teaching people how to ranch the old way. Like get the cattle down into the creeks because that's where the best vegetation is. Actually move them into the creeks. So now they're teaching us move them out, keep them out, have them up on the upland areas and bring water up to them, and do rotational grazing and things like that. So we have to. You would think that they would be, the educational institutions would be leading these efforts, but oftentimes they're not. We've also found educational institutions teaching farming, and they're teaching to the overuse of fertilizer. We're talking to one professor that said he recommends that they use 3 times as much as needed in the crop because it's cheap insurance. So they're actually teaching it. Environmental organizations. Environmental organizations need to, I think, do a better job of recognizing what the actual high priority environmental issues are and working on those instead of the thing that might bother them the most in the short term. So often when I deal with environmental groups or work with environmental groups in our organization, they will talk to me about a particular issue that they're interested in, and I will say, why are you focused on that when we have this wholesale habitat destruction in our region? And pollution, the runoff, the massive erosion problems that are caused by that on a very large scale. Why this postage stamp sized problem that you are fixated on? Why are you spending your resources on that? I think that environmental organizations need to get together. They need to leverage their efforts and be focused on the highest priority issues that are creating that potentially terrible future for us. So that was all I had. The change that I'm talking about here is fundamental. It's a change of the way we think and the way we act, and it is extraordinarily difficult to do. And we're starting with us in our organization because we realize that change isn't about all of you changing, it's about us changing. So we're trying to hold ourselves accountable for those kinds of changes that I'm talking about, become a more performance-based organization, and be able to measure those tangible changes in the real world.
Thank you. All right, so Chris and Brad, you're going to join us on the stage. And there's probably a switch here. Is there a video mute? Yeah.
I think it's this.
Woo. twice. Alrighty. So, okay, that was pretty sobering. Chris, I'm going to put you on the spot. You heard what Michael said. We can't have scientists telling us there are 100 things we need to know before, I can tell you with certainty. So given that, what would be your top 3 research priorities, having heard what you've heard tonight for ocean acidification?
Okay. I'm going to give the tiny bit of backdrop of, and as soon as you mentioned that, I thought of global cooling, which really did look like it might happen in the 70s. And now that's this huge embarrassment for the sort of climate science community. And so I think scientists are very sensitive about saying we have enough information to feel confident with our predictions. So with that backdrop, the things that I think we really need to do better are, one, get after what's going to happen at the level of an entire population, because with very, like maybe one exception, we might know fertilization kinetics for this species and larval development for this one and adult growth for this one, but nobody's put all that together for a species and said, okay, the population growth rate is going to change by X amount due to ocean acidification. We literally can't say that with any real confidence yet. So that's one. Getting beyond so that's getting beyond single life history stages. Getting beyond single species would be the next stage. So, all right, if you do a study on salmon, was one of the things that came up at dinners. Lots of fish seem relatively robust in the face of acidification, but what about all the things that they eat? How is the food chain below them going to be altered? And we don't have a good feel for that yet. And then I think the third big unknown is the degree to which evolution and adaptation may partially come to the rescue, because right now we can only do our experiments with the current genetic signature of all these plants and animals, but the future genetic signature is going to be different.
Okay. Brad, do you agree with that?
I'm not in a position to say what the research agenda should be. I'm not a scientist.
I'm asking you.
Yeah. I can tell you the things that I'm working to build out research and monitoring capacity on, because they're what I think matter. But that's me as an observer and player in the system, not a scientist. We need a lot more monitoring capacity in some of the places where change is happening fastest. And I think we need it for a bunch of reasons. To me personally, the most important is that if you take the people who are losing their livelihood and you give them the observational capacity to know it, they become a league of witnesses you cannot silence. So for example, right now in Maine, soft-shell clam, Maya arenaria, has a really clear correlation in do you have productive clam flats or don't you? The answer really hinges at pH 8. If the clam flat pH measures below 8, you don't. If it's above 8, you do. The data is pretty persuasive. So the people who produce that animal need to get in place the observational capacity to show really in detail what's happening where they're trying to make a living. And when they own that information, they become people who have a lot of resonance. They become people you really want to be speaking. They belong in this discussion. So that kind of monitoring capacity I think is crucial. For that reason, and also because sometimes it helps them survive. We have had what some people have described as a holocaust of shellfish over the last century. The world's oyster reefs are down by about 99% in the last century. The standard easy explanation is we just ate them all. And that's probably not a sufficient explanation. It's particularly not sufficient when you start looking more broadly at the whole, the role of shell from old shellfish in keeping mudflats productive. When shellfish settle out of the plankton and settle down to do their serious growing up, they like to land on another piece of shell because it conditions the habitat chemically. It becomes a place where they can survive and not dissolve. That is a geochemical function that those reefs used to do. Now that they're gone, that geochemical function is missing. And vast quantities of habitat throughout the northern latitudes are just gone. There were clam canneries from Northern California to the Bering Sea when I was born. And they were all up and running. And they're gone now. Not one of them's open, not one of them's run for about 50 years. And those clam populations, by and large, have not come back. It's possible that's just a function of density-dependent reproduction. There's not enough of them there. It's also possible, and we don't have the monitoring capacity in place to know this yet, that the chemistry of those bays where they grow has changed enough that a lot of it's down there somewhere well south of 8, and they're just not, they don't even have a prayer. You saw what the pictures of dissolving larvae. That's happening in countless numbers in bays all over the place. And until we develop the capacity to prove it and put that capacity in the hands of people whose livelihoods are being dissolved, it's like having the songbird you depend on to sing, unable to sing. They're mute. They literally cannot play their role in the discourse of this problem until we give them the observational capacity.
Okay, so that your comment about the clams has reminded me of the Marine Life Protection Act process where we were looking at all the marine protected areas that existed in California, and there was one for the Pismo clam, and it was decided that that particular MPA really wasn't necessary because there were no more clams left. So its objective had expired essentially in that location. But I want to come back to, so you get the monitoring in place. We know enough right now to know that there's tremendous natural variability or tremendous variability in pH along our shoreline. And as we think about ways to set up standards for this, you know, how do, this is for you, Michael, and I know, Brad, you have an opinion about this too, but how do we reasonably set standards, water quality standards, for example, when we know already that the variability is just staggering. It swings wildly up and down. And so should we not be thinking along the, sort of the conventional, you know, path of setting, you know, 0.2 pH units, you know, off natural ranges? How should we be thinking about this from a regulatory standpoint?
I think that first that we should describe what's causing it or contributing to it, what causes pH to decrease, and what pollutants are those, and then control those pollutants, control the discharge of those pollutants to the maximum extent that we can. So instead of having it based on a standard in the receiving water, have it be based on the ability, the maximum ability, and there are standards in the Clean Water Act, for example, like best technology available or best technology available, so that they're based on the technology and our ability to control those. We have a tremendous ability to control pollution. We just don't necessarily apply it. So when we start doing that, there's a paper that was actually written on this very subject. And in that paper, which I can send to anyone who's interested, they talk about how the big gains in pollution reduction didn't happen initially with the Clean Water Act. It happened when we started to apply technology standards. When we said, if the technology exists for you to not discharge this pollution, then you cannot discharge it. which changed the argument from the receiving water or the environmental impact and trying to measure that environmental impact, trying to measure cause and effect, and trying to come up with a standard. An almost impossible task. Cause and effect measuring it, cause and effect in the environment is darn near impossible when there are so many different things going on. So we let go of that and started saying, you can control this pollution, so therefore you will control it. And we don't have to prove something in the environment.
Okay. Brad, what's your reaction to that?
It sounds like a great shortcut if you can make it stick. One of the Brock Bernstein is here. I asked him to come, and one of the reasons is that he's been involved in a process that does create a dynamic regulatory standard for some of the components of this problem. And I wonder, Brock, can you explain a little bit about, in a few words, on how that works?
Just very quickly, in systems where the attempt is to control biological endpoints rather than just chemistry numbers, then we really do have to pay attention to environmental variability because we're trying to understand, as Michael was saying, what the causes and effects are. And so the State Water Board, working with EPA, is trying to figure out more dynamic regulatory frameworks for managing systems where the end result is that people are trying to manage or protect is really a biological system, not a number like a pH or a level of chemical. But it's extremely complicated, and it takes a long time to develop those.
So the shortcut, if you can pull it off, would be great.
Sure.
Yeah.
How do we bring other stakeholders into this discussion? Anyone?
Well, for instance, in our efforts to change how we regulate agriculture, irrigated agriculture, we had to bring in others in order to show the complete picture. So what we had been doing is working with a very small group of stakeholders, predominantly ag interests. And that actually was consensus-based. So the group actually agreed. So in 2004, when we adopted an order with that smaller group of stakeholders, we were able to come to consensus. Then when we had to renew that order 5 years later, we decided that we needed to bring in more people who were affected by this situation. And when we did, consensus went out the window. So now we've got a full range of stakeholders with many varying different perspectives, widely different perspectives on the issue. And some people still say to us, you need to go back to the consensus approach. And we say, here's our mission statement, and the word consensus is not in it. We're supposed to be protecting resources for future generations. And most of the time, that is not going to result in consensus. It's going to result in change from the status quo. And so we just have to go out and find those people and invite them into the process. Even when it makes the process extraordinarily controversial, we have to be willing to do that. So we just go out and identify who they are, and we meet with them and invite them. And we bring them in. You have to be proactive.
Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
One of the things I found interesting from Brad's talk was the power that the shellfish lobby can actually apply in an often counterintuitive direction when it comes to regulation. And the reason that the shellfish growers and the aquaculturists are on board is that they've had their Hurricane Katrina moment. And this has happened in BC too, where there were a couple of years where they could not get their larvae through all the way through development, and they're just hemorrhaging money. And tying that to pH, and pH isn't the only problem, but the realization that is the major driver has really gotten them on board. And whether or not we are going to have to wait for other industries and other stakeholder groups to have their Hurricane Katrina moments, or if we can start drawing connections and say, you know what, your fishery is not all that different from the experience of the oyster growers, and you need to be thinking about this too. I think we should definitely shoot for that, but it remains to be seen how effective we can make those ties.
Brad, you were talking earlier today about the tribal communities as really effective stakeholders. You want to say a few words about that?
Sure. Well, we think that Friday, the governor of Washington State is going to announce the creation of a blue ribbon panel whose job will be by June to provide the state government with advice on how to understand, mitigate, adapt to, and remediate ocean acidification. This occurred because there's a strong constituency in the shellfish industry in Washington State, and there's a strong constituency in the tribes. The Tulalip tribes and Taylor shellfish carried the water for this idea. And it moved from a first draft on paper about 3 weeks ago to being ready for announcement this week because they went to work. I wish it's another subject, and maybe we'll come back to it, but what the Tulalip are doing to address the restoration of carbon and nutrient balance throughout their watershed in the whole of Puget Sound, and how acidification plays into that, providing kind of a galvanic story that motivates people to get on board with a whole range of things that ultimately support everything you're doing. For example, the entire range of runoff and nutrient effects and all the over-irrigation and over-fertilization, all the logging of the headwaters that results in just wholesale erosion and the loss of soil that washes down into Puget Sound and brings its carbon load, overloading the system in the marine part with too much carbon and depleting it upstream. I mean, all of this is built into a vision for restoration that has as its time scale something like 30,000 years of history that they've been living in that valley. They were there when the ice ages started. They were there when the salmon stopped coming. They were there when the salmon started coming back. And they're driving. It's pretty phenomenal. 30 years ago, the Tulalip were a tribe whose headquarters consisted of a few trailers. Now, they've been one of the successful gambling tribes. They've also been very, very successful at leveraging that in the development of their natural resource programs and everything else. They have a really powerful program. They're a major landowner in their area. They can negotiate with and play carrots and sticks with landowners and the agricultural community. They have the farmers in their valley breaking off from the State Farm Bureau because the Farm Bureau does not support the kind of activity that you're all about. And they in their negotiations with the tribe have decided this is the way to go. This works better for us. We get a better deal this way. Let's do it. So they've formed their own independent farm bureau that works with the tribe on the tribe's vision because it's what works for them. I mean, this to me is environmental leadership. This is as good as it gets. And to me, in a year or two, we're going to have an incredible story to tell about how far this is moving.
We need a Tulalip tribe in Central California.
Yeah.
So the other questions that you guys had prepared, I think the panelists have covered to some degree already in their presentations. And so I want to make sure we have time for other thoughts and questions in our remaining time. Margaret, how much time do we really have left?
Minus half an hour.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So if that's the case, then I know that these three gentlemen are willing to stick around for a few minutes for questions that you might have to bring to them individually or perhaps in small posses. So join me in thanking them and thanking also Ryan Kelly for doing all the Journal Club work prior to this evening. And, Christy Croker too? Yes, Margaret's pointing towards you. And also to Margaret for